Today we're going to learn about pedigrees and how you can use a pedigree, commonly known as a family tree, to determine how traits are passed from one generation to the next, and even how alleles are passed on. First thing you need to know about a pedigree is what symbols to use. In this example, you can see we have a mother and father, Jenny and Mike, who have had 2 sons and 1 daughter. To draw this pedigree, we're going to start by putting a symbol for Jenny, which will be a circle, and for Mike, a square. Males are square, females are circles. Because they're married and had offspring, we connect them with a horizontal line down the middle. Jenny is my circle, and Mike is my square. Branching off, I have 3 offspring. 1 son, a second son, and 1 daughter is named. One son, Jeff, is married to Sarah. And together they have 2 children, a boy named Mark, and a girl named Chloe. The other daughter, their daughter, Sophia, married Luke, and together they had 2 children, both sons, one named Scott, and the other one named TJ. Again, as you read the description of the family tree and compare it to the pedigree, you can see that wherever we have a horizontal line going to the middle indicates the couple had offspring. Whenever individuals are connected by a common horizontal line, that indicates that they are siblings. Siblings. They come from the same 2 parents. Now in this next example, we see a pedigree, but now we're not just going to indicate relationships, we're going to indicate traits, characteristics that are passed on. The words that you need to know when solving this type of a pedigree is heterogeneous, or heterozygous, and homozygous, dominant, recessive, and you also need to know how to do a Punnett square. What we see here are 2 individuals that had offspring, and their offspring, one of their offspring, met one of the other couple's offspring and had their own children as a result. So we have 3 generations. 3 generations of families represented. The shading in this example is intended to show you about traits being passed on. In this case, it indicates eye color. The first thing I need to do in order to determine the actual alleles is read my question at the top and determine which trait is dominant. Is the dominant trait the one with the shading, or is it the one that isn't shaded? That will help me determine what allele combinations I'm looking for. Now the alleles I'm going to be working with in this problem are big E for eye color and little e. And when we combine those, because we always have two alleles when we have a gene, we have three possible combinations. Big E, little e, big E, big E, and the third possible combination is little e, little e. The first combination here would be what we would call heterozygous. The second one would be called homozygous. And the third one would be called homozygous as well. The difference between the last two is this final one is homozygous recessive. It's recessive because they are lowercase, meaning that we will only see this particular trait when there is no dominant allele present. A good example of this would be the lighter hair color. Often they use eye color. Eye color really is determined by more than one gene, but they use it as an example, indicating that blue is recessive to brown. So whenever we have the big one present, the blue doesn't show. Whenever we have the big B present, for instance, the blonde hair will not show up. This is important because remember that whenever there is a recessive trait, there's only one possible combination of alleles. They both must be little. They both must be recessive. If even one big E is present, the big E masks, it hides the other allele, meaning that that individual will have that dominant trait. If we keep this in mind, we can use this as a hint to guide us in filling in the alleles for these family members. So, the first step said, determine which trait is dominant. Is it the shaded or the unshaded one? And the way we do this is we test out our theory. Let's try, for instance, over here on these two parents. Let's explore the possibility that these two parents have the dominant allele, okay? If they have the dominant allele, they could be like this. Another possibility would be both E, big E. Or a third possibility would be big E, little e, big E, big E. And you ask yourself, if this is a dominant trait, the shaded one is dominant, would you expect the offspring to look like this? You can take each one of those and work a Punnett square. I'm going to try a little bit different. I'm going to try out the recessive one. Let's see if the shaded one is recessive. So I'll put in little e's here. Because if it's not recessive, then it must be a dominant trait. If we did a Punnett square like this with both recessive mom and dad, every single one of these would be recessive. What that's saying is that every single offspring, 100%, would have the trait. Is that what we see here? No. One of them does not have the trait. So therefore, this can't be recessive. And since this is shaded in, and this one shaded in, neither one can be correct. That means we've now determined the answer to our first question. The dominant trait is the shaded one. Well, how does that help you? Well, a dominant trait would show up if we had this. It would also show up if we had this. Those are both genotypes for a dominant phenotype. But the recessive, there's only one option. The recessive has to be little e, little e. So if the dark is dominant, then the white must be recessive. And every single one of these that is white will have little e's. So So you've already got 7 of these figured out. And once you know more about the offspring, that will give you more hints about their parents. So let's work from there now. We know all the white are recessive. That means the remaining dark shapes are either big E, little e, or big E, big E. And based on what we know about the children, the offspring, we can figure it out. Take, for instance, this family. In this family, we know that every family member gets one allele from the dad. This is dad here, okay? Dad's going to get one allele, and mom here is going to provide the other one. And since both of these have little e, we know one of these alleles came from dad. One of them came from dad. And the other one had to come from mom. Well, if we already took the one from dad, that means this remaining little e here had to come from mom. The remaining little e had to come from mom. So we've now determined that this parent must have a little e. If it doesn't have a little e, where did this child get its second little e? It had to come from the mom. We also know that in order to have this dark trait, the dark eye color, we have to have a dominant e that's going to mask the little e. Once we know that the mother is big E, little e, that makes figuring out the remaining ones as simple as doing a Punnett square. In fact, you don't even have to do a Punnett square, and you could probably guess as to what these are going to be. If mom is big E, little e, and dad is little e, our combinations are big E, little e, little e, little e, big E, little e, little e, little e. And you can see that 50% of the offspring are going to be just like mom. 50%. Nowhere in this Punnett square do we come up with big E, big E. It's impossible with a dad that's recessive. Therefore, we know big E, little e, big E, little e. Now that we know this second parent of the third generation here, we can figure out what possibilities we have for the remaining child. Once again, remember that mom over here must contribute one of those two E's. And since they're the same, it doesn't really matter which one. So now we know one of the two alleles. And just as before, if this is the dominant trait, we must have a dominant allele. And that had to come from the father, which means we got our big E from the father. Okay? Now, you might notice that the percentage here differs from the percentage here. I don't see 50% here. I don't see that. I see 50% here. You might say, well, how is it possible if I cross a heterozygous and a homozygous recessive? Why do I get different outcome? Remember that when it comes to this type of a problem, genes don't remember. Alleles don't remember. Just like flipping a coin. You can flip a coin 10 times in a row and get tails every time. That doesn't change the probability for the 11th flip. That doesn't make the 11th flip that much more likely to be tails. And even though I have 3 that have the recessive instead of 2 recessive and 2 heterozygous dominant, that doesn't mean that my 50% won't hold true if this couple has more kids. Eventually, with enough trials, enough flips of the coin, you will get roughly 50% heads and 50% tails. How do I know this is right? Because there's only way possible to get that dominant trait is to have the dominant allele. And the only way possible to get these three kids with the recessive trait is for one parent to provide a little e and the other one to provide the other little e. So now what remains is this other family, and we can use the same logic and work backwards from there. I have two parents that both have the trait, so I already know that both of them must at least have a big E. And if they were all E, well, let's just see what that would be. If both parents were big E, well, you wouldn't have this one at all. So that's impossible. If one parent was big E, and the other one was little e, you wouldn't have this outcome either. So let's try this out. Let's try big E, and big E, little e. Again, you may not have to do the Punnett square. You can work through the logic in your head, but sometimes it's helpful to draw it and actually see it. When I do this combination, I'm going to get what percentage are going to have the dominant trait? Well, any of the ones with the big E will have the dominant trait, and you can see that the outcome is 100%. Does that match what we see down here? 100% are dark? No. So obviously that can't be the answer. So let's try increase our odds of getting the little e by making both parents heterozygous. And now I get big E here, big E, little e here, big E, little e here, and little e here. Now we see this one recessive shows up right here. And the remaining ones, all of these, show the dominant trait. When 3 out of 4 show the dominant trait, that's 75%. That's exactly what we see here. 1, 2, 3 out of 4 show the dominant trait. So not only does it match up, but we can see now how it's possible for this one here to receive the little e from mom and the little e from dad and be recessive. All 3 siblings have the dominant trait. The only problem now is figuring out exactly what these 3 remaining allele combinations are. We know that if they're dark, it has to have a big E. That has to be present. And if we look up at our example here, looking at this example, we have one option, one offspring turned out that way, but 2 others turned out like this. So I don't know whether it's going to be that or that in any one of these cases. How do I know if this is the one that's big E? Maybe it's this one here. So the way to solve this is to not solve it, to simply put a question mark for my second allele, indicating I know the first one's dominant, but the second one is unknown.